I'm Alex Tokmakchiev. I'm from Creative Assembly Sofia, and today I want to talk to you about how we used player feedback in order to evolve A Total War Saga Troy's user interface and user experience. It is 38 degrees outside. We have only about 45 minutes, so let's get started. Now, this talk will not be about how to organize and conduct user tests. It won't be about how to gather player feedback or how to set up a user research team. All of these topics have already been covered online, and you can check out some really good resources at the Game UX Summit channel or the Games UR Summit channel on YouTube. I'm also not going to be talking about how we make UI at CA. That I covered a couple of months ago, and again, you can watch it at our YouTube channel. What I will talk about and I want to focus on is what feedback we gather at CA and what we use to gather it, how we use it to improve our UI and UX. And in order to do that, we're going to take a look at two case studies from Troy, aptly named the Entering the Debacle and Turning the Tide. Now, what I hope you take away from this talk is that you should always test your assumptions. That having good UX requires you to consider all feedback from all players. That if possible, you should give players a choice. That the best way to show players you're listening is by acting, not by talking. And that it is okay to not know all use cases as long as you test and get feedback, because you will encounter the blind spots in your design and you will be able to address them. Now, who am I? As I said, I'm Alex. I'm a huge Cowboy Bebop fan. I'm part of an online community called We Can Fix It in UI that is trying to push forward UI and UX in games and put forward best practices and ethical practices and help out everyone that's interested in the industry. I'm an avid game jammer. I've been participating in game jams for more than 5 years, and for the past 2 years, I've actively been part of the organization of Sofia Game Jam. It is not far-fetched to say that if it weren't for game jams, I wouldn't have been in the games industry. But probably the reason why you're here listening to me is because I'm a lead UI UX game designer on Total War. That is basically a very fancy way of saying that I work at the Department of Buttons and Stuff here at Creative Assembly Sofia. Now, CA Sofia is a sister studio of Creative Assembly. It was founded in 2017 when Sega Europe and Creative Assembly acquired Crytek Black Sea. During our first years, we were cutting our teeth and getting experience by developing DLCs for Total War Rome 2, before moving on and working on our first standalone title, which we released in August 2020, called A Total War Saga Troy. Since then, we've been actively supporting Troy with new content, like the Amazon's DLC, the Ajax and Diomedes faction pack, and the recently announced huge update to Troy called Mythos, which is bringing mythological creatures and a historical mode to Troy, letting people play the way that they want. Now, what is a Total War Saga Troy? Well, first and foremost, it is a Total War game. Total War has been around for a while, more than 2 decades, in fact, during which 16 titles have been released, and that does not count and take into consideration the additional content that has been developed during those years. But a Total War game itself, what is it? Well, it's actually 2 games into one. First and foremost, it is a grand turn-based empire management game, where you get to choose a faction and you develop its economy, its armies, you engage in diplomacy with other factions, and you basically try and conquer them and have them do your bidding. Whether you do that through political ways, economical ways, or military ways, it is up to you. On the other side, Total War is offering spectacular real-time battles that take place on huge battlefields with thousands and thousands of units that clash together to form very, very impressive and visually magnificent battles. Troy itself is set specifically during the 10-year siege of Troy and explores the legendary conflict and is heavily inspired by the Iliad. Now that we've established what Total War is and what Troy is, let's move on to feedback channels. Feedback channels. What do we use here at CA in order to gather feedback? A couple of things. First, we have internal playtests. These are quick tests that we usually do during pre-production or production, and they're completely internal. They're done with other Creative Assembly devs to quickly and fast get feedback on a particular prototype or a new mechanic that we're working on. We also do external playtests, where we get people from the outside to test a specific part of the game. Maybe it's tutorial and onboarding, or how battles feel. We also do active community monitoring. Basically, everything that gets posted on Reddit, as YouTube comments, on Twitter, on Facebook, on our Total War forums, on our official Total War Discord channels, we see. We also do game previews where we send a build of the game to partners and we try to get feedback from them. And finally, we do active data gathering post-launch of a game, which is basically gathering whatever stat that we can, from how well is the economy of players doing around turn 62 to how many players are using a dual setup of monitors on 4K resolution. How does this feedback channel work? Well, we have a very specific flow. At the center are the project teams. They're the ones that conduct the internal playtests, as I said, because it's just fast. However, they actively work and communicate with 3 other teams that form the backbone of the feedback gathering. We have the influencer relations team that is connected to our partners and content creators, and they're the ones that organize the game previews, where we give a build of a game, perhaps a small part of it, maybe one battle, or the whole game, and we try and get feedback and impressions from them. We have our centralized user research team that is organizing our external playtests and then giving us an incredibly comprehensive and detailed report about what players did, what problems they experienced, what they liked, what they disliked. We also have our community team, which is the one actively monitoring our community. And once a week, they provide us, again, with a report that lists the highest priority issues that have been raised by the community, interesting topics that we should know about, for example, and a bunch of other stuff. Now, getting back to Troy and to its production timeline. So we started production in November 2018. During production, we also started doing our external tests. This usually happens around midway. Right before we hit alpha, we started doing external tests focused on onboarding and tutorials. We're going to talk about those in a bit. We entered beta in June 2020, and that was also the point where we did a game preview for Total War Troy, and we started active community monitoring because that's when our marketing campaign began. And we released the game in August 2020, which is when we started getting actual players, the data gathering began. We released our first DOC at the end of September 2020, and since then, we've been actively supporting the game. Now, we're going to focus on 2 specific periods in this timeline. The first one spanning from February 2020 up around the release of the Amazon DOC, and this is the Enter in the Battle. The second one from the start of beta up until 1 or 2 weeks before release, called Turning the Tide. Now, let's go into the Enter in the Battle. So, as I said, Total War is a turn-based game. What does that mean? Well, it means that players take turns where they execute a number of actions. So, for example, they can construct new buildings, they can move armies, they can recruit units into their armies, whatever they want to do. They have a set amount of things they can do at a turn, then they end their turn, and that is when the AI or the other player does their turn, and so forth and so on. So, turn-based empire management. So, for the longest time, during Total War Troy's development, the way to end the turn in the game was via this little button here with the hourglass. This is actually something that we inherited from Warhammer 2, and it has been the way to end the turn in a Total War game since around 2014, 2015. So, we just took it. Players were used to it. That's how they were ending their turn. So we just stuck with it and stylized it to match the ancient Greek settings. Now, there's also one additional system to ending a turn in Troy, and that is called the pending action systems. So this is very useful. So the idea is that if you have actions that you have not done, we will basically show you what those are, and they appear at the place of the enter button to basically remind you what you can do and make sure that you don't forget anything that you can do before ending your turn. So these can be, for example, as you can see here, it says research available. So that means that if you click on that button, it will open the row decrease screen where you can research new technologies. This can also be, for example, a hero not moved button notification, or construction available in one of the settlements. You get the idea. Basically, it is great in that sense, but it caused some issues. Before we get to that, for Troy, we had agreed on a couple of pillars, game pillars. Our first one was that we wanted to reach a new audience, especially considering that Troy was going to be exclusive to Epic. We knew that that would bring a lot of new players that hadn't played a Total War title before. And that meant that we needed to make sure that our onboarding and our tutorialization system made it easy for them to get into the game so that we can retain them. We also wanted to make Troy as accessible as possible, regardless of people's experience with strategy games or Total War games, and to also make it accessible for people with disabilities. And finally, however, we still had in mind our core players. So we put as a pillar familiar and consistent, because we didn't want to stray too far away from the Total War formula that players had been used to for the past 2 decades. Now, in February 2020, right before we entered Alpha, we had our first external onboarding and tutorial test. This was by the time when most of the tutorialization was already in the game. We had the initial part of the game already in, and we were pretty confident about that. So we set up a test that had a few objectives. The first one was to check if new to Total War players that have played PC strategy games but not Total War are able to play through our tutorial campaign, which is with Agamemnon. And the second objective was to discover any usability issues with game mechanics or UI. So the candidates that we got for this test were all users who had no prior experience in Total War games. People went through a couple of steps through this test. The first one was that they had to play through Troy's tutorial campaign. Then they played the 2 tutorial battles that we had. And finally, our user research team asked them questions about their experience that then they used in order to compile the report. Now, we went in pretty confident about to this test. We were expecting good results because, well, everyone in the office was playing the game perfectly fine. We had no issues. The tutorial campaign seemed good. We liked it. So you can imagine our surprise when, on the day that we got the report, the very first issue on the top of it was this. Game turns were not understood. Now, for a game that 50% is turn-based management, when you see game turns were not understood, that's a huge red flag. And it seems that 4 of the 6 users did not realize that the game is turn-based. They not only didn't realize and understand what game turns are, but players didn't even realize that the game is turn-based. And they had to ask their moderator for help to explain to explain them how to progress in the game, because they couldn't progress. So when we saw this, we were pretty much like this. I mean, to highlight how weird that was, this is from one of the user tests. And I can't play the video for GDPR reasons, but I want you to focus on the timer on the right that says 1 hour, 6 minutes, and 16 seconds. This is how long this player had spent on their first turn, doing everything that they could, but not ending their turn, because they did not realize the game is turn-based and they can end their turn. Yeah. That's a massive whoops. And obviously, we were hugely surprised because we didn't expect it. But we're like, okay, we're going to fix this. Let's get back to work. And the first solution that came to us was the most obvious one. We put Clippy inside and it's done. It's fixed. Now, obviously, we didn't do that. mostly because Microsoft would have sued us, most likely. But yeah. So what we started doing was we started to try and figure out what the issues were, why players didn't realize it's a turn-based game and they can and how to end their turn. So the first issue that we analyzed and found is that our pending action system, the one that I told about you earlier, that basically removes the end turn button unless you've cleared out all of the actions that you can do that during that turn, is great for regular Total War players, and they're used to it, sure. But it's absolutely devastating for new players because, I mean, it is a big yellow button down there that says research available, and some of the players, they didn't want to do research on their first turn. So they never clicked that button in order to go past that to see that there's an end turn button below it. And they also didn't notice the little gray arrow on the side that when you click, it skips all of the action notifications and takes you just directly to the end turn button. So, you know, obviously not a great experience. So what was the solution to this? Well, we explored two different approaches. First, both aimed at basically detaching the pending actions button from the end turn button. Here you can see a mock-up of the first solution, which was to just take the pending action button away and put it on the left side. However, we felt that this would be too confusing because now the label research available wasn't entirely clear whether it was for the left button or for the right button. So we explored a second solution where we're like, okay, let's take all the pending actions. And instead of showing them one by one and, you know, having players click through, for example, 15 of them at a late stage of the game, let's put them all in a new menu, which we're going to call notifications. Let's expand them with new content. So, for example, it's not going to say just hero not moved anymore, but it's actually going to say which hero you haven't moved. In this case, you can see Agamemnon. So that way, we accomplish two things. We keep the end turn button constantly visible for new players, and for veteran players, we expand the feature that they're used to, and we give them a nice to-do list that they can go through. Now, there was one issue with this. This also meant that we no longer had anything to stop players from ending their turn, even if they had pending notification. And we just assumed that they would open the menu from the new button that we added because, you know, it was a nice big button. We added a counter that even said how many notifications you have, and it was glowing when you had unresolved notifications. Yeah, never assume. So, issue number 2. If you see this hourglass icon on a button, what would you assume the button does? Well, we didn't assume initially, but one of our QAs internally raised it. And it's like, you know, I don't get it. Why are we using an hourglass here? And we're like, well, an hourglass, I mean, it means end turn, right? But we decided to organize a survey and ask people exactly that. What does an hourglass icon mean when they see it? And here are the answers we got. It means loading, waiting, buffering, in progress, speed up time, slow time. All of these words and verbs that have nothing to do with ending a turn and moving on to a next turn. And why would they? I mean, since Windows 95, Microsoft has basically been telling people and teaching them that an hourglass icon means a loading action, that something is loading, that something is in progress. And it makes sense. It really does. However, we were so used to having an hourglass there, we didn't even consider that people might not interpret it the same way that we do. And my reasoning for this is that I think that at one point, you know, when Heroes of Might and Magic 3 first used an hourglass to indicate enter button, we kind of all just assumed that, yeah, that's the way to go, and that's how we're going to do it from now on. But the problem here is that not everyone has played Heroes of Might and Magic 3, number one. Number two, there are many players, especially from the new generation, that haven't even heard about Heroes. So, basing all of the design of of the enter action on that is, well, just, it doesn't work. So what was the solution? Well, the solution was very simple once we realized what the problem was. And it was basically to just change the icon and switch it to a symbol that made sense to people and was actually connected to the verb of ending turn and next turn. So we switched the hourglass and we put right-facing arrow, incredibly similar to the icon that's used on all the media players like Netflix and Spotify and stuff like that, to indicate the action of next track, next chapter, next movie, whatever. And at this point, we're like, hey, I think our work here is done, right? I mean, we solved the problem with we solved the first issue. The button is always visible, and now we no longer have any confusion with the icon. Boom, work is done. We did some tests. People really did end their turn now, and we had no problems. Feels great. Or is it? Now, August comes, we release Troy, the game comes out, people start playing. We're super excited. We start reading the comments and trying to get all the feedback that we can, and we start encountering something that we didn't expect. I forgot to move my army. Where did the little notifications go? Why did you remove my enter notifications? It helped me when I was playing, and now I forget to do things constantly. Please give me back my pending actions. So we had a new problem. The notifications were still in the game, but players just weren't opening the list to see them. And that required a new iteration. Now, we made a classic mistake here. We tried so hard to make it easy for new players that we neglected an established UX pattern that our core players had been using for years now. And apparently, our assumption that, they will notice the new button, it's visible enough, and they will click it, well, it proved wrong. And that's our failure here, because we didn't test that specific assumption. So what do? We looked back and decided that, having something to kind of like block you from ending a turn, it makes sense. However, we needed to change the context around it. So we brought back just one action that obfuscates your enter, and that only appears if you have unresolved actions in your notifications list. And it's in the form of this icon of the exclamation mark icon that you see bottom right. And when you click it once, it immediately disappears. It opens the list with end actions upwards. And then you can choose whether you want to do the actions or you can end your turn directly. So we added just one step before ending the turn. And that tested great, because even players who had problems with finding how to end their turn, they would eventually click through everything. They would click there, boom, it would clean the button. They would see the end turn button. Now it had a new icon, and then they would click that to continue forward. Also, we retained the functionality to remind players that they had unresolved actions, but we didn't we didn't have them go through 20 of them in order to just spam click. No, we just opened the list and then they can see everything there. So yeah, sometimes you have to look back in order to continue forward and serve a better user experience. And however, by the time that we released this feature, the game had been already out for a couple of months. So we pushed that together with Amazon's DLC, if I remember correctly. And we realized that by that point, there would have been a lot of players who would have been used to the previous to the previous UX flow of just having their end turn button constantly visible. So, we gave players a choice. We added a new option in our game settings that allowed them to enable the notifications button before enter, so that they could choose whether they wanted to have the reminder or not. It is up to them. And that is the state that we left it at. And it's a pretty good state for now. I'm not saying that we're not going to update it any further, but for now, we're happy with it, and players seem happy with it as well. Now, moving on to the second case study, Turning the Tide. Again, to remind you, this took place right around at the time that we entered beta in June 2020, and it lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks. So, before we move into it, we need to talk about battles, and specifically battles in Total War Troy. So, in June, we planned to have our first gameplay reveal. So we were going to send out a build to our content creators that we partner with, and it was a battle between Achilles and Kector that they could play with. And we were incredibly excited for them to get their hands on it, because we had introduced some new features to the battle system in Troy that we were eager to show people. And those include, for example, different unit weights and types, because Troy is very infantry heavy. We have light units that are low on armor, but are very fast, and they can inflict a lot of damage. We have medium armored units that can be shielded or unshielded. We have heavy units, again, they can be shielded or unshielded. We have elite units who are like special units that are unique per faction. We have mythical units, and we also have the powerful single entity hero units. So in order to represent these on the battlefield and on the HUD, we used a set of icons. So for the unshielded ones, and we have 3 different variations of the circles that indicated their weight, light, medium, and heavy. We had the same for shielded units, but the form was not a circle anymore. It's a little shield. Again, it grows, it gets more detailed and gets more strokes the higher the weight. And then we also had unique ones for the elite, the hero, and the mid units. So, gameplay reveal time. Everyone is pretty excited here at the office. We've been working for this for a long, long time. We can't wait for people to see the gameplay for the first time. And we're hyped, you know. We're like, it's happening, isn't it? It's finally time for people to see the gameplay of the first Total War standalone game that we've been doing here. And content creators start putting out their videos. We start watching, and then we start reading the comments, and we start hearing the comments. And well, here are a couple of quotes. I can't tell the difference between the different weight units. Health and morale UI is way too big and blocks a lot of the actual battle. It is impossible to know the weight variety of units simply by looking. You can't prioritize targeting anything if you can't identify what they are at a glance. And to be honest, they were right. I mean, look at it. This is our battle HUD. You know, at a glance, can you tell which of these units here is a shielded unit, and which is an unshielded unit, and which is a medium unshielded unit, and which one is a heavy shielded unit? No, you can't really. And, you know, we had done tests of the battle, but those were mostly focused on how the battles felt. The players understand some of the new features that we had implemented, like, for example, you know, the new terrain types, or the interactive grass, or hiding in forests and having your units invisible, and all those things. But no one really reported any problems with the UI, except the circular minimap that we changed later. So we just assumed that, you know, the HUD here and the icons, they're okay. And they weren't. So this happened in early June. We were supposed to release in August. So obviously, I mean, we entered panicking modes. We had less than 2 months until release. And the first gameplay reveal, the reception wasn't what we expected. It wasn't great. So what could we do, right? We're like, okay, let's try and get more data. So on the same day, we sat down, we organized a survey that we sent out to our content creators to ask them a bunch of questions related to the battles and to the HUD. So we wanted to learn more about how easy it was for them to identify the different unit weight types. Were they able to tell different units in their army? Were they able to tell their stamina, health, and ammunition, and all of those things? And, you know, we wanted to put some value onto that to see which were the highest priority issues that we had to address because we didn't have time to address everything. And these are some of the results. 4 out of 5 as a score that it's somewhat hard to identify different unit wait times, and that's detrimental to the gameplay of the battle. So terrible. Mixed score on telling apart the different units in your army. Luckily, we had some good results here in terms of discerning your own units from the enemy units. Thank God. Yeah, we sent out that survey on the same day or on the day after. I don't remember correctly. And we waited for feedback. Now, there was we also asked content creators what improvements would they make to the UI, right? And we got some really good feedback from that and some very, very good responses, like, clarity in what regards heaviness of a unit, like the shield at the bottom is not clear enough. That needs to be easier to tell the difference between heavy and light infantry units. That they also reminded us, hey, in Rome 2, you had a great way of telling the weight of a unit through the shape of its banner. They also told us that the unit UI bars, for morale and health, they need to be skinnier because they just taking way too much space. And that we can use different figures for the unit icons in order to represent the weight. Now, this survey had an unintended side effect that we didn't really expect. And that is that by reaching out so fast to people after the negative feedback that we received, it made them feel that we value their opinion, that we care and truly want to give them the best experience. And we really do. We really do. That's why we sent out the survey. Like, we wanted to fix those things in order to give them the best experience that we can. It also made them feel that we make mistakes, but are eager to fix them. And all of these are things that people came to us and told us after they participated in the survey. And here's one quote. Thanks for valuing our opinions enough to send this form out. It is appreciated. And again, I want to stress out, as this was unintended. We did not do it in order to get some good positive points with the community, but it just goes to show to you that if you are proactive, even if you make a mistake, fans and players will forgive you. They want to see the best game as well, and they are ready to work with you in order to push it forward to where it needs to be. Right. So we received the results from the survey, and we entered a 2-week sprint where we tried to fix as much as we can. The biggest issue being, telling apart different unit weights and types. So we went through a couple of iterations. The first one being that we explored different background colors on our unit cards to identify the weight of the unit. Now, this did not test well. People couldn't tell them apart that easily. And because it meant that our colorblind players would have a problem, even when we updated it with proper profiles to match their color blindness, it still wasn't easy enough and fast enough. So we're like, okay, let's take our unit icons and let's do the work there. We did 2 iterations there. The first one, taking the idea from Rome 2 and using different shapes to represent the different weights. So we have circle for light units, rhombus for medium units, hexagons for heavy units. Elite units we represent by putting a golden stroke around it, and special units have their own little special icon to basically emphasize that, well, they're more powerful and to stand out. We also explored a solution where we're like, okay, we're going to keep the idea with the strokes and we're going to use just one shape, but we'll try and emphasize the details more. So, for example, the light units here you can see are very, very simple circles, and then the medium one gets like a second stroke and 2 rhombuses on top, and then the heavy one gets like this very detailed pattern. But when we tested, again, it is much easier to remember the connection. Circle light, rhombus, medium, hexagon, heavy, than to circle light, double circle with 2 strokes, medium, circle with more patterns and a bunch of rhombuses inside as ornaments, heavy. So we went with the different shapes. Now what you will notice here is that we no longer indicate whether a unit is shielded or unshielded with the icons. And that is because we decided that the unit cards are big enough and they show the shields prominently enough that we don't need to add the extra layer of communication through the icons, so we can keep those just for the unit weight and the unit type. And after we updated the design, this is what we ended up with. A lot cleaner and a lot better. We also did a bunch of other improvements. Like you can see, we reduced the height and the size of the different bars. We tried to make them more compact, and we gave players more options to customize which parts they want to turn on and turn off. So they can turn off portraits, they can turn off all of the bars, they can turn off the status effects, whatever they want. All of this resulted in a video that we published at the end of July called We've Made Some Changes, which is a 90 seconds development update that basically showed that a lot of the issues that folks had raised during our initial gameplay review, we had now addressed, and we were actively working on fixing them in the game. One of those issues being, the updated Battlehead UI. The result of that video was that we had more than 250,000 views across all of our channels. And the impact on the community, well, you can check it out for yourself. It was overwhelmingly positive. We got comments like, continue listening to the community, make this game even better. It is so great to hear that you're taking some criticism to heart. It's a step in the right direction and feels less of a given up title now. You step towards us, we step towards you. Thank you for your hard work. And, just the community being positive about us and appreciating the fact that we were trying to address all of those issues. And that is how we turned the tide from the initial negative response that basically started worrying fans, and they just became negative towards the game, to give them back hope and make them positive. And that resulted afterwards in more than 7.5 million copies of Troy being claimed in a single day. So yeah, back to takeaways, now that we've gone through the case studies. So, first and foremost, always, always, always test your assumptions. I mean, we had assumed that everyone knew that an hourglass icon represents an enter. They didn't. We had assumed that just because our regular Total War players were used to the pending action system and they knew how to end their turn, that new players we will too. They didn't. So yeah, if we hadn't tested those, we would have released with those issues, and we wouldn't have made the improvements that we did. Having good user experience requires you to consider all feedback from all players. Coming out from the first one, we made it great for new players, but then we stripped back a feature that core players had been using, and it enabled them to define a new play style. So, we brought that back, but only because we listened to their feedback. If possible, give players a choice. Don't enforce it to them. Allow them to play the way that they want to play. The best way to show players you're listening is by acting, not by talking. When the negative feedback came out, we didn't start telling people that we did it because of that and because of that, and that's how it's going to be. And okay, we're going to try and fix that, but we're going to promise. No, we reacted. We gathered the data that we needed. We did the changes and we pushed them forward. And that's why we got the positive reception. And finally, it is okay to not know all use cases as long as you test and get feedback, because you encounter the blind spots in your design. And that's exactly what happened. That was the talk. Thank you very much for your time. If you're interested, we have a bunch of open positions at Creative Assembly that you can check out at creative-assembly.com. If you want to learn more about user interface and user experience in games, please visit wecanfixitiny.com. This is our online repository of our UI UX community, where there's a ton of resources about UI and UX in games and best practices and videos and lectures and tutorials and articles and case studies by incredibly smart people. And now it's Q&A time. Thanks a lot.